So, Chapter 5, Section 2, all about the Enlightened Despots. Despot, not despots, despot. That's how you say that. An enlightened despot. So what is a despot? What do you have to be a despot before you can be an enlightened despot. So what's a despot? A despot's another way to say absolute ruler. And the same folks we've been talking about for several weeks now. So what is an enlightened absolute ruler? What makes them different than other absolute rulers? They know all? No. What? That's correct. They are open to reform. They're open to some change. This is a little confusing because we had to skip 5.1 since I'm not going to be here tomorrow, but the Enlightenment is a period of time, kind of like the Renaissance, where there's just change going on. But the Enlightenment is mostly change in intellectual ideas, change in thoughts about how things should be. And so what happens is Enlightenment authors and thinkers who are called theosophists, they begin to publish their works. And certain rulers read their writings. Voltaire is one who influenced both Frederick and Catherine the Great. Diderot's Encyclopedia was read. It was banned in France. Diderot's Encyclopedia was. It was a banned book. So I guess that tells us that Louis was not exactly an enlightened despot. But Catherine the Great exchanged letters with Voltaire. Frederick invited him to come and stay at his palace. So, could you be aware of the Enlightenment and not be an enlightened despot? Absolutely. You had to adopt some of the ideas and some of the ways of thinking in order to be considered an enlightened despot. Let's talk about Frederick the Great first here. There are definite things that a ruler can do that signal to us that they are enlightened. Now, we talked a lot when we talked about Frederick back in 5.4, or 4.5, 4.4, the last chapter. We talked about him being a very autocratic ruler, very much an absolutist, believed in divine right. He knew best for his people. What we didn't talk about is the characteristics that he had of being enlightened. Now, Frederick believed, and it's his words, that he was the first servant of the state. What does that mean? I am the first servant of the state. Dylan?
He serves the state, he serves the people. Within.
He serves the state and serves the people, yeah. Is there more to it than that? He's not the first ruler, per se. But what he saw is that he had to be the first one to step up and say, I serve my people, I serve my country. He had to be the trendsetter, set the example for everyone to follow. That's what he meant by first servant of the state. And remember when we talked about Frederick before, I told you he viewed himself as a father to his people. This is in keeping with that kind of mentality. Okay. Along those lines, Frederick made some changes to Prussia while he was ruling. One of the first things that he did was he allowed the press to operate without censorship, and we call that a free press. I'm not saying that the newspapers were free, as in no pay. I'm saying that they were free of censorship. Prior to Frederick's decree that the press would be free, all publications had to go through a censorship process, and the government officials could just say, no, you can't write that, you can't say that. Now, understand that when this went into place, the newspapers were still very cautious. You would not see writings that were tremendously critical of the government, and certainly very few things that were directed directly at Frederick. No newspaper publisher was going to put out an article that said Frederick is fat and ugly and stupid, and he's the worst leader we've ever had. Sure, there's a free press, but you still have to think about the times that exist. And so the furthest that they would go would be to say, some of these policies seem a bit harsh and perhaps could be reconsidered. So not, we should hang him by his toenails and rip his hairs out one by one. Okay? Very, very gentle, very kind of feeling their way through, wow, do you seriously mean I could say whatever I want to say? Okay. To prove that he was a kinder, gentler king, Frederick actually reduces the amount of torture allowed in his prisons. Quite a difference from what his father did, right? Where he imprisoned Fred for running away from home and then made him watch his best friend have his head chopped off. So Frederick says, much, much less torture. He actually had a set of rules that specified circumstances in which torture was allowed, and even then, some of the most severe, the most harsh tortures were rarely allowed and had to have his express permission. Frederick believed in some religious tolerance. He actually welcomed Jews into Prussia. He stopped harassment of Protestants and Catholics within Prussia. This is not all that long, guys, after the 30 Years' War, which was a war of religion. And this territory is where most of that fighting went on. This is a huge and dramatic change. Now, unfortunately, it's not going to be a tremendously lasting change, but this is significant. Frederick knew that his government structurally was kind of messed up. And so what he did is he said, I have to fix the civil service. Do you guys know what civil service is? Civil service is a way to refer to all government employees. If you work for the government, you are a civil servant. Civil being government, servant, employee. Okay? What had happened previously, and even in Frederick's first years of his reign, is you got a government post, you were appointed to it or hired to it, and you held it for life. No performance reviews, no making sure that you were actually doing your job right. Somebody could basically buy a government position for himself. So let's say we make Lance the tax collector for an entire little state within Prussia. Okay? And Lance got that job because he was the best friend of the cousin's nephew of the Kaiser, okay? And he made a donation, wink wink, to the court, okay? Well, Lance gets that job and he gets to hold it for the rest of his life. Now, what are some qualifications that you would expect the tax collector to have?
Knows how to count.
The tax collector should be able to count and add and subtract, yeah, and maybe write to keep records of who he collected money from. And yeah, didn't really matter once Lance got that appointment. If he's illiterate and can't even count to 10 with all of his fingers and toes, he's still going to be the tax collector. So how good do you suppose this government is, right? Judges were appointed who didn't know the law, who had never practiced the law, okay? And so Frederick sets out a system of rules. He doesn't exactly put civil service exams in place, which made sure that you were qualified to do your job, but there were more obstacles to becoming a civil servant, and jobs were not necessarily for life. You could be fired for being crooked. You could be fired for corruption. You could be fired for dereliction of duty. If I appoint you judge and you never actually preside over a trial or a hearing, yeah, you're not going to keep getting paid and you're no longer a judge under Frederick. So this is a pretty dramatic change. It actually enriched Prussia because the government became a lot more efficient. There was a lot less money wasted. It's remarkable how much revenue comes in when your tax collectors can actually count the money that's handed to them to make sure that they've been paid the right amount of money. It's pretty astonishing, isn't it? Okay. And then one of the most lasting changes that Frederick made was he streamlined the laws. So what's one law that is pretty much universal? Every country has a law prohibiting something. What would be prohibited?
You can't kill someone.
Okay, murder. Okay, murder is against the law. That's pretty much universal. But there are some exceptions, right? Justifiable homicide. We've got, in some places, stand your ground today. Back then, there were a lot of exceptions where killing somebody is okay if these things. Where things got really complex back in this time period is in the penalties. Okay. Here we have a set of things. If murder is premeditated and the death penalty exists in your state, you could be put to death. In Mississippi, murder has to be premeditated and accompanying something else. You have to have broken into the house, so theft or breaking and entering and murder. Or you have to have raped and murdered. Or kidnapped and murdered. Back in Frederick's day and age, a lot of how the law applied to you depended upon your position in society. If you are a noble, the penalty might not be as harsh and things are not applied as evenly. A peasant caught stealing a loaf of bread could spend years in prison. Okay. Now you're thinking to yourself, well, a noble's not going to steal a loaf of bread. Okay, fair enough, probably accurate. But is it fair for a peasant to spend years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread? Yes. France takes a long time to reform their legal system. And that happens after the French Revolution, even. That's 1830s in Les Miserables. So what Frederick does is he works through the legal code in Prussia and tries to make it a little more fair, tries to make sure that you get to trial a little faster, that your case actually gets heard, that things move along so that if you get sucked into the legal system for one reason or another, you can move on and get out. Okay? Joseph II, where's he from? Austria. Yes. Joseph II is Maria Theresa's son. He inherits the throne. He is the Holy Roman Emperor. And he is by far the most enlightened of our despots. He is so enlightened, he practically glows in the dark. Joseph proclaimed religious equality in Austria. Not just for Protestants and Catholics, but also Jews. This is unheard of. Total religious equality. No prohibition from holding a government position, no prohibition from owning land, no prohibition for being in any type of business. Didn't matter what your religion was in Joseph's Austria. This is stunning. Huge. Guys, this is remarkable. Joseph also allows a free press. And in Austria, you could refer to him as fat, dumb, and ugly and get away with it. That's how free the press really is in Austria. Again, remarkable. Yes?
You took attendance.
I did take attendance, thank you. Joseph abolished serfdom. Serfdom is? Yeah, where the peasants are tied to the land. So Joseph says, you know what? Not anymore. Peasants can go wherever they want. Who does this upset? The nobility, the landholders. They just lost their free labor. Now, who keeps a king on the throne? The nobility does. The peasants are uneducated and unorganized. They're not going to rebel and overthrow much. The nobles, if they like the king, they keep him in place. If not, I'll just ask Charles I. Right? So how does Joseph get the guts together to tick his nobles off this much? He sells it to them. He tells them our economy will be stronger. We need to change. We can't just live with an agrarian economy. We can't just be farmers forever. And our people can't live in deep, deep poverty forever. We have to make some changes or we're going to fall behind and we'll be crushed. He makes it a we need to progress kind of situation. And he points to England and the success of the British economy. And the Austrian nobles, while not thrilled and rejoicing and building huge statues of praise to Joseph, they begrudgingly accept this. And then Austria, seat of the Holy Roman Emperor, he is the Holy Roman Emperor himself, goes after the Roman Catholic Church. Says the whole purpose of the Roman Catholic Church would be for charity, to care for the ill and the poor. And he goes out and he takes away land from the church. Any monastery or convent that wasn't providing for the ill, that wasn't maintaining a hospital, or that wasn't taking care of the charity that it said it was, he took away their land and their property and gave it to the convents and monasteries that were caring for the poor and the ill. Who crowns the Holy Roman Emperor? The Pope. Newfound respect for Joseph, anyone? This is guts. This is guts. Huge guts. To Russia! Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great has two faces when it comes to being an enlightened despot. She has corresponded with Voltaire. She has read Rousseau and Locke and Hobbes. She's a highly intelligent woman. She understands the ideas behind the Enlightenment, and she fully supports them, but not in Russia. She believes that the Enlightenment would not be successful in Russia because its populace is too poor and too ignorant, and that Russia really does belong under totalitarian rule. With that said, she does make some changes. Catherine abolishes torture, gets rid of it completely. Not kind of halfway like Frederick did. Well, maybe we need to keep it around just in case. Just in case. No, she says, done, done. Catherine also institutes religious tolerance. A little distinction here. Catherine decrees that religious tolerance will be practiced in Russia. But she doesn't enforce that decree very aggressively. So there is still a fair amount of persecution of the Jews in Russia even following Catherine's decree. So say one thing, do another. Right? How many of you have that relative who will be like, oh, honey, you shouldn't smoke. It's bad for you. You should never start. Smoking will kill you. Right? This is Catherine. We need to be religiously tolerant. Your Highness, they're burning a Jewish village in the east. Oh, they shouldn't be doing that. But she doesn't say, send the army and stop it and rebuild the village. She says, oh, that defies my decree. Next. She criticized serfdom. Serfdom is bad and unfair, and I don't think we should have it. And guess what she heard in response to that? Oh, yeah? See, in Russia, so much of the population is at the serfdom level. There are so few nobles comparatively that the nobles, when Catherine said icky things about serfdom, the nobles went, shh, don't let them hear that. But they did. Word got down to the serfs that she was thinking about making some changes to the system of serfdom. And the nobles went, no, don't do it. You won't keep the throne. And she said, well, I still think that maybe there's room for... And so some of the nobles, in kind of a preemptive move, cracked down on their serfs, which prompted a serf rebellion and uprising which swept across the southern Russian countryside. Nobles were attacked and killed in their own homes. They were driven away. Their homes were burned and ransacked and looted. There was even a peasant czar who named himself leader of the peasants in Russia. They fought the Russian army that Catherine had to send and put them down. And so once Catherine had subdued this peasant rebellion, this serf rebellion, she stopped saying things about serfdom not being okay. And the fact that that rebellion had occurred, that nobles had been killed, their families killed as well, convinced her that Russia was definitely not ready for the Enlightenment. Catherine, you'll notice, unlike in Austria and Prussia, never allowed freedom of the press. Never allowed freedom of the press. There were underground newspapers that existed in Russia that were critical of the government, but she couldn't face a free press on the surface. In the end, how much absolutism versus enlightenment existed in each of these countries? With Frederick, he remains an absolutist monarch who believes in some Enlightenment ideals. If any of these folks had gone whole hog Enlightenment, what would we have had? Democracy, according to anybody but Hobbes. So Frederick remains an absolutist. When he dies, a somewhat free press remains. Some religious toleration remains. Torture comes back. But the improved civil service and improved legal system remain. So Frederick's imprint as an enlightened despot stays upon Prussia. Yes, ma'am?
Why were they so into, torture?
It was believed that someone would never just tell you the truth unless you put them to pains. Catherine. We've talked about how she kind of drew back from Enlightenment ideas even during her reign. She draws back from Enlightenment changes even more the older she gets, as the serfs become more and more restless and the nobles become more and more concerned. As she ages, that makes her hold on the throne weaker, and so she wants to draw the nobility to her to make sure that they are completely loyal so that she's safe. And so Enlightenment changes kind of fritter away. Remember, she had abolished torture? Well, after that serf uprising, torture doesn't seem like such a totally bad thing anymore, and it works its way back in. Most of her reforms are repealed after Catherine's death. And then poor Joseph II of Austria. Pretty much everything he does within days of his death is undone. The religious toleration goes away. The free press goes away. Serfdom, bing, bang, boom, back overnight. Now, can you imagine being a serf in Austria? You've been free, and now, boom, back tied to the land. Ugly, ugly situation. So everything Joseph did gets rolled back on his death. Those are the 3 Enlightenment despots that you need to know for this test and for the final. Other things that happen during this time period that aren't philosophical, but that deal with the arts. The book does a pretty good job of covering these, so I'm just going to hit them real quick. Bach, Handel, Haydn, Mozart. These are Enlightenment musicians. This is called the Romantic period in music. New forms of music, new ways of organizing a work of music evolve during this time period. And these guys are all innovators in it. Mozart is going to start in this time period when he's 5 and will progress and actually be an artist who bridges on into the next period. You should recognize all of these guys as classical composers. This is the time period where classical music is created. Whenever you tend to hear something played by an orchestra, you're like, oh, that's classical music. Well, not always. Technically, it has to be in a certain form and from a certain time period to be categorized as classical music. Baroque. If it ain't fixed, it must be Baroque. Okay. This is an artistic style that comes about pretty much Louis XIV in decorating Versailles. Baroque architecture, Baroque decoration is over the top. Lady Gaga would have loved the Baroque period. Way over the top. If a little gilt, G-I-L-T, that's gold leafing and decoration. If a little gilt signifies wealth, and Louis is the most powerful, most wealthy monarch ever, then what does he need? He needs a lot of gilt. He needs everything to be coated in gold leaf and shining and ornate and carved. Everything has to be marble and shiny and crystal chandeliers, and everything just has to be so big and huge. Baroque, you can tell something is Baroque by it being way over decorated, by it being dripping in gold leaf and gold paint. It's just, when you look at it, you're like, wow. Wow. Too much. Too over the top. Okay? It's like sewing sequins on top of sequins and then sewing sequins to the feathers that you sew on top of the sequins sewn on top of the sequins. And then throwing a little chiffon on there. Okay? Putting heels under your high heels. Okay?
This sounds
To look at Baroque architecture it is a little bit of sensory overload. You can walk into a Baroque church and just kind of go, what? Because the background colors in Baroque tended to be white, so that all of that gold really stood out. So you walk in and it's gold and white, gold and white, gold and white. You're just like, too much. Okay. So everybody kind of agreed that a little bit of Baroque went a long way. And so after Louis's death, when Louis XV comes to the throne in France, he kind of dials things down a little bit, and we get the Rococo style, which is decorative, but it's more muted. It's not so in your face, yo, I'm rich! See? It's kind of, I'm rich and I have a little taste. It didn't have to be jamming it down your throat. It's less over the top. It's more refined. If you walk into a place and you see a little bit of gold leaf, but you're not like, wow, oh my gosh, so much gold leaf, chances are it might be Rococo. Questions?
Do we need to know Daniel Defoe or any of the other writers?
It would not hurt you to know one or two authors, but you do not need to commit them all to memory. What is significant about writing during this time period? What changed? What is new? The novel is developed during the Enlightenment. And the novel is a long-form story. Elena, how come you're packing up? You've got 10 minutes left.
Oh, never mind. I got the time wrong. I lied.
Okay. A novel is a long-form story, a work of fiction. People are far more literate now. They have a little bit of leisure time, and so they can just read a story for the heck of it. So that is significant for you. Good job getting the thing I purposely left out of lecture.
We got salons.
Salon.
There's
Salon.
salons.
Salons evolve in France during the Enlightenment. The noble women tend to not have a lot to do with their time, and they tend to have a lot of money and lots of pretty dresses and not as many opportunities to show them off as they would like. And so what they started doing was inviting these Enlightenment thinkers to their homes for tea and maybe a late lunch, and they would just expect them to sit and talk and entertain their guests. And so the ladies would come and gather and talk to these Enlightenment thinkers, and then other Enlightenment thinkers would stop in. And salons were just places where free exchange of ideas could happen. And salons really helped the Enlightenment to flourish. Because how much money do you suppose there is in sitting in a room and thinking of new ideas and writing them down? It's not a tremendously profitable kind of job. So salons are kind of like where Renaissance artists found their patrons. Enlightenment thinkers find their patrons through salons. And sometimes they would become house guests of these wealthy women and would have their meals and room and board provided for them, sometimes a new suit of clothes, just for being around to invigorate the mind. Not a bad life, huh? Any other questions?
Censorship.
What is censorship?
Or are you asking us?
I'm asking you.
It's like restricting access to ideas.
Yeah. So when I say free press, that's saying there wasn't censorship. The government didn't go through and say, you can't say that, you can't say that. When Louis banned the encyclopedia in France, that is a prime example of censorship.
So we should know.
Yeah, vocab word, for sure. What else?